The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Commander Jake Morrison walked through the corridors of the Special Operations Command. 23 years of service had taught him to read people quickly, but the woman sitting in the waiting area outside his office presented a puzzle he couldn't immediately solve. She sat with perfect posture, her civilian clothes clean but worn, hands folded calmly in her lap. There was something in her stillness that reminded him of the way seasoned operators carried themselves, a quiet confidence that came from facing danger and surviving. Her eyes, when they briefly met his, held depths that spoke of experiences most people would never understand. "Commander Morrison?" His aide approached with a file folder. "The woman you're supposed to interview is here. Sarah Chun says she has information about Operation Desert Falcon." Morrison's blood chilled. Operation Desert Falcon was classified at the highest levels. Only a handful of people knew the details of what had happened in that godforsaken valley in Afghanistan 3 years ago. How could a civilian possibly know about it? He gestured for her to enter his office. As she walked past him, he noticed the slight limp in her left leg and the way her eyes automatically scanned the room's corners and exit points. Definitely military training, he thought. "Please, have a seat," Morrison said, settling behind his desk. "I understand you have information about a classified operation. Before we go any further, I need to know who you are and how you came by this information." Sarah looked directly at him, her voice steady and clear. "Commander, 3 years ago, your SEAL team was pinned down in the Karengal Valley. Insurgents had them surrounded on 3 sides. Your men were taking heavy casualties, and air support was 40 minutes out." Morrison's jaw tightened. Everything she said was accurate, but this was information that hadn't appeared in any official reports available to civilians. "Go on." "Your sniper, Petty Officer Martinez, had been hit. The team was down to their last magazines. The insurgents were moving in for the kill." Sarah paused, her fingers unconsciously touching a small scar on her neck. That's when someone started taking out the enemy shooters from the ridge to the north. The commander leaned forward. This was getting into territory that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Ms. Chun, how could you possibly know these details?" "Because I was the one on that ridge, sir." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Morrison studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. He found none. "That's impossible," he said finally. "Our intelligence showed no friendly forces in that area. No American units, no Allied forces, no contractors." Sarah reached into her jacket, moving slowly and deliberately. She pulled out a worn leather folder and placed it on his desk. "My discharge papers, sir. Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. Military Occupational Specialty 0317, Scout Sniper." Morrison opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. The documents appeared genuine, honorable discharge, commendations, training records. According to the papers, Sarah Chun had been one of the first female Marines to complete Scout Sniper School. Her record showed deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, multiple commendations for valor, and specialized training that would have qualified her for the most elite units. "If this is accurate," Morrison said, looking up from the papers, "then you were discharged 2 weeks before Operation Desert Falcon. How were you in Afghanistan?" Sarah's expression grew distant, as if she were looking back through years of pain. "Sir, the official record shows I was discharged due to medical reasons after an IED incident. What it doesn't show is that I never left the country." "Explain." "The explosion that supposedly ended my career killed 3 of my teammates. Good Marines, sir. The best." Her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "I was medevaced to Germany, then supposedly sent home for medical discharge. But something went wrong with the paperwork." Morrison frowned. "Wrong how?" "I fell through the cracks, Commander. In the chaos of processing casualties, my records got lost in the system. I was listed as discharged, but I was still in a military hospital in Landstuhl. When I was finally fit for duty, there was nowhere for me to go. Officially, I no longer existed." The story was becoming clearer, and Morrison didn't like where it was heading. What did you do? I tried to report to my unit, but according to the computer systems, I'd already been discharged. I tried to contact my commanding officer, but he'd been transferred. The Marine Corps bureaucracy is a massive machine, sir, and I was just one person with questionable paperwork. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training grounds where young sailors were learning the basics of military life. I spent 3 months trying to get it sorted out, living in cheap motels, making phone calls, filling out forms. But every office I visited told me the same thing. According to their records, I wasn't their problem. Morrison was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. So you were legally discharged, but never actually processed out of the country. Exactly, sir. And while I was fighting the bureaucracy, I was also dealing with survivor's guilt and untreated PTSD. I wasn't thinking clearly. When I finally gave up on getting my status corrected, I made a decision that I'm not proud of. You stayed in Afghanistan. Sarah nodded. I had contacts in the private security world. Men who'd worked with our unit who knew what I could do. They offered me work, off the books, cash payments, no questions asked. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could figure out what to do with my life. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Ms. Chun, what you're describing is desertion. Regardless of the bureaucratic problems, you had a duty to report through proper channels. You're right, sir. I know that now. At the time, I was angry, hurt, and not thinking straight. I felt abandoned by the Corps, by the system I'd served faithfully for 6 years. So I stayed, and I worked for private military contractors who didn't care about my legal status as long as I could do the job. Sarah returned to her chair, her composure never wavering despite the gravity of her confession. For 2 years, I worked in the shadows. Convoy security, perimeter defense, specialized reconnaissance. I was good at staying invisible, which made me valuable to people who operated in the gray areas of the conflict. Morrison was struggling to reconcile the professional, articulate woman in front of him with the story she was telling. And that brought you to the Karangal Valley. Yes, sir. I was working with a small team doing intelligence gathering for a contractor that I won't name. We were observing insurgent movement patterns in the valley when your SEAL team inserted. Sarah's eyes grew distant again, and Morrison could see her reliving the events. We weren't supposed to engage. Our orders were strictly observational. But when the shooting started and your men got pinned down, I couldn't just watch Americans die. So you broke orders. Yes, sir. I told my team leader I was taking a better observation position. Instead, I moved to the ridge with my rifle and started engaging the insurgent positions. Morrison consulted the classified file he'd retrieved from his safe while she was speaking. The official record of Operation Desert Falcon mentioned the mysterious sniper fire that had broken the insurgent attack, but intelligence had never been able to determine its source. The after-action report shows 17 confirmed insurgent kills from the ridge position, Morrison said. Extremely precise, long-range shots that allowed our team to break contact and reach the extraction point. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. 18 kills, sir. Your report missed the spotter in the tree line who was calling in mortar positions. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. The number 18 had never appeared in any official document, but it matched the classified body count from the insertion team's sweep of the area after the battle. Ms. Chun, assuming everything you've told me is true, why are you here now? Why reveal yourself after 3 years? Sarah reached into her other pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. She placed it on the desk next to her discharge papers. Morrison picked it up and saw that it was an obituary from a military newspaper. Sergeant Martinez died last month, sir. Cancer. He was one of the SEALs I helped save that day. Morrison remembered Martinez, a good man, a dedicated soldier who'd struggled with injuries from that operation until his death. I'm sorry for your loss, but I still don't understand why you're here. I read about his funeral, Commander, how his teammates honored him, how the community came together to support his family. It made me realize something important. Sarah stood up again, this time facing Morrison directly. For 3 years, I've been living in the shadows, telling myself that I was forgotten, that nobody cared what happened to me. But those men I helped save went on to serve with distinction. They had families, careers, lives that mattered. And I played a small part in making that possible. Morrison could see tears forming in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. I want to come home, sir. I want to face whatever consequences await me for the choices I made. But more than that, I want those SEAL team members to know that they weren't saved by a ghost. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of military life continuing outside. Morrison found himself facing a decision that would affect not only this woman's life, but potentially the careers of everyone involved in the cover-up that had allowed her situation to develop. Ms. Chun, what you're asking for isn't simple. There are legal implications, career implications, political implications. The military doesn't like to admit it makes mistakes, especially mistakes that result in situations like yours. Sarah nodded. I understand, sir. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the chance to set things right, to tell the truth about what happened, and to accept whatever consequences come with that truth. Morrison looked at her discharge papers again, then at the newspaper clipping, then at the classified file that documented the operation she'd described with impossible accuracy. Every instinct told him that she was telling the truth, but the implications were staggering. If I were to pursue this, he said carefully, it would require a full investigation. Your story would need to be verified through multiple channels. The SEAL team members would need to be interviewed. There would be congressional inquiries, media attention, probably a court-martial. I understand, sir. Morrison made his decision. Ms. Chun, I'm going to make some phone calls. I want you to return here tomorrow morning at 0800. Don't discuss this conversation with anyone. Don't leave the local area. And, for God's sake, don't talk to any reporters. Sarah stood up and gathered her papers. Thank you, Commander. You're the first person in 3 years to listen to my story without immediately dismissing it. As she reached the door, Morrison called after her. Ms. Chun, those 18 shots you made in the Karengal Valley, how far were they? She paused with her hand on the doorknob. The closest was 600 meters, sir. The farthest was just over 1,200. Morrison whistled softly. Even for a trained Marine sniper, those were exceptional shots under combat conditions. One more question. Why should I believe that someone who's been living off the grid for 3 years suddenly wants to come forward and face the music? Sarah turned back to face him, and for the first time since entering his office, she smiled. Because I'm tired of being a ghost, Commander, and because those SEALs deserve to know who had their backs that day. After she left, Morrison sat alone in his office for a long time, staring at the documents she'd left behind. If her story was true, it represented a failure of the military system that had far-reaching implications. But it also represented something else, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be taught in any training manual. He picked up his secure phone and began making the calls that would either vindicate Sarah Chun or destroy both their careers. As he dialed the first number, he found himself hoping that the men she'd saved would prove worthy of the sacrifice she'd made for them. Chief Petty Officer Danny Rodriguez was enjoying his morning coffee when his phone rang. 3 years had passed since Operation Desert Falcon, but he still woke up most mornings thinking about that day in the Karengal Valley. The nightmares had finally stopped, but the memories remained as sharp as ever. Rodriguez, he answered, recognizing the number as coming from Naval Special Operations Command. Chief, this is Commander Morrison. I need you to report to my office at 1400 today. Bring Petty Officers Thompson and Jackson with you. This concerns Operation Desert Falcon. Rodriguez nearly dropped his coffee cup. Desert Falcon wasn't something they talked about anymore. The official debriefs had been completed years ago, and the mission was buried deep in classified files. Sir, may I ask what this is regarding? I'll brief you when you get here, Chief. And Rodriguez? This conversation doesn't leave the four of us for now. After hanging up, Rodriguez stared at his phone for several minutes. Desert Falcon had been a turning point in his career, but not for the reasons anyone might expect. Oh, they'd completed the mission successfully. The high-value target had been eliminated, and intelligence had been gathered. But it was what happened during the exfiltration that had haunted him. They'd been compromised somehow. The intelligence that said the valley would be lightly defended had been wrong, or the insurgents had been tipped off. Either way, Rodriguez's six-man team had walked into a carefully prepared ambush. He could still remember the moment when the first shots rang out. Martinez, their sniper, had taken a round through the shoulder in the opening seconds. Thompson had dragged him to cover while Rodriguez tried to establish their tactical situation. It had looked grim from the start. The insurgents had positioned themselves well. They controlled the high ground on three sides of the valley, with heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. Rodriguez's team had superior training and equipment, but they were outnumbered at least 4-1, with no cover except for a few scattered rocks. That's when the miracle had happened. Rodriguez remembered the confusion he'd felt when the first insurgent machine gun position went silent. Then a second and a third. Someone was shooting the enemy fighters with surgical precision from impossible distances. In 12 minutes of intense combat, an unknown sniper had systematically dismantled the insurgent attack, giving Rodriguez's team the breathing room they needed to reach the extraction point. The official debriefs had been strange. Intelligence officers had questioned them repeatedly about whether they'd seen the sniper, whether they'd had any communication with friendly forces in the area, whether their radios had picked up any chatter. The answer to every question had been no. Their mysterious guardian angel had appeared and vanished without a trace. Rodriguez had his own theories about what had happened, theories he'd shared only with his teammates late at night over beers. Maybe it had been a CIA operative working off the books. Maybe it had been special operations from another country. Maybe it had been a contractor team that couldn't officially acknowledge their presence. But deep down, he'd always known it had been someone special. The shooting had been too precise, too tactical, too perfectly timed. Whoever had been on that ridge understood infantry tactics at a level that came only from extensive combat experience. Now, 3 years later, Commander Morrison wanted to discuss it again. Rodriguez felt a mixture of curiosity and dread as he gathered his teammates for the mysterious briefing. When they arrived at Morrison's office that afternoon, they found the commander studying a thick file with obvious concern. Thompson and Jackson took seats while Rodriguez remained standing, his training telling him this wasn't a casual conversation. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, "what I'm about to share with you is highly sensitive. 3 years ago, your team was saved by an unknown sniper during Operation Desert Falcon. Today, that sniper has come forward to identify herself." Rodriguez felt the world shift around him. "Herself, sir?" Morrison nodded gravely. "Her name is Sarah Chun, former Marine Corps Scout sniper. And, gentlemen, her story is going to complicate everything you think you know about that day." For the next hour, Morrison outlined Sarah's background and the circumstances that had led her to be in the Karengal Valley. He explained the bureaucratic failure that had left her in legal limbo, her decision to work for private military contractors, and her choice to break orders to save their lives. Jackson was the first to speak when Morrison finished. "Sir, you're telling us that a Marine who was officially discharged but never actually processed out of country decided to go rogue and work for contractors." "That's correct." Thompson leaned forward in his chair. "And she happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to save our asses." "Not happened to be," Morrison corrected. "She was conducting surveillance on insurgent activities in the valley. She saw your team insert and made a tactical decision to provide overwatch protection when the situation deteriorated." Rodriguez found his voice. "Sir, I need to ask the obvious question. How do we know she's telling the truth? How do we know she's really the person who made those shots?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Two reasons, Chief. First, she provided details about the engagement that have never appeared in any official report. Details that only someone in the Overwatch position could have known. Second, she correctly identified the number of enemy casualties from her position." He pulled out a photograph from the file. This was taken during the post-battle assessment. 17 confirmed enemy Kia from the ridge position. But Ms. Chun says there were 18. Rodriguez studied the photograph, remembering the sweep they'd conducted before extracting. Sir, we did find a body that wasn't initially counted in the official tally. Spotter position, about 50 meters from the main concentration. Single shot to the head from extreme range. Morrison nodded. That detail never made it into the official reports because of classification concerns. Only 4 people knew about it. The 3 of you and your team leader, who's now assigned to Special Operations Command Pacific. Ms. Chin mentioned it specifically. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Rodriguez felt a strange mixture of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite identify. What does she want? Thompson asked. She wants to come home, Morrison replied. She wants to face whatever consequences await her for the choices she made, but she also wants the truth to be known. She's tired of being a ghost. Rodriguez stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training facilities where new sailors were learning the basics of military life. Sir, what are the legal implications here? For her, I mean. Morrison's expression grew serious. Potentially severe. Technically, she could be charged with desertion, unauthorized absence, and violation of her oath of enlistment. The fact that she worked for private military contractors while officially listed as discharged complicates things further. And for us? Jackson asked. Unknown. If it becomes public that a discharged Marine saved a SEAL team during a classified operation, there will be congressional hearings. Questions about how she fell through the cracks in the system. Questions about why military intelligence couldn't identify her during the investigation. Rodriguez turned back to face the commander. Sir, I have a different question. When can we meet her? Morrison looked surprised. Chief, I'm not sure that's advisable. This is a legal matter now, and Rodriguez cut him off. Sir, with all due respect, this woman saved our lives. Whatever legal trouble she's facing, whatever bureaucratic mess led to her situation, the fact remains that 6 SEALs are alive today because she chose to break orders and help us. Thompson and Jackson nodded in agreement. Thompson spoke up. Commander, I got 2 kids at home who are alive today because of what she did. I don't care what paperwork says or what legal complications this creates. I want to shake her hand. Morrison studied the 3 men carefully. Gentlemen, I need to make something clear. If this becomes an official investigation, you'll all be required to provide testimony under oath. Your statements could determine whether Ms. Chun faces court-martial or receives clemency. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Then, we'll tell the truth, sir. She saved our lives when she had no obligation to do so. She risked her own safety to protect American servicemen who were in trouble. In my book, that makes her a hero. Jackson leaned back in his chair. You know, sir, I've always wondered about something from that day. The shooting was too good, too precise. Whoever was up there understood small unit tactics better than most officers I've worked with. What do you mean? The target selection, sir. She didn't just shoot randomly at insurgents. She took out the machine gunners first, then the RPG teams, then the spotters. She systematically dismantled their ability to coordinate and maintain suppressing fire. That's not lucky shooting. That's professional infantry work. Rodriguez nodded. Jackson's right. I remember thinking at the time that whoever was helping us knew exactly what they were doing. The timing, the target priority, everything was textbook combat support. Morrison made some notes in the file. These observations will be important if this goes to an official hearing. Ms. Chin's tactical knowledge and decision-making could be significant factors in determining her fate. Thompson had been quiet for several minutes, apparently lost in thought. Finally, he spoke up. Sir, I have a question that might sound strange, but I think it's important. Morrison gestured for him to continue. Has anyone asked Martinez's family about this? I mean, he's gone now, but if they knew that a female Marine had helped save his life, don't they have a right to know about it? The question hung in the air, highlighting another layer of complexity to the situation. Rodriguez realized that Thompson was right. This wasn't just about legal proceedings or military protocol. It was about honoring the sacrifice and service of everyone involved. Morrison closed the file and looked at each of them in turn. "Gentlemen, I'm going to arrange a meeting. Unofficial, off the record, just the four of you and Miss Chun. You deserve the chance to meet the person who saved your lives, and she deserves to know that her actions matter to real people with families and futures." Rodriguez felt a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying begin to lift from his shoulders. For 3 years, he'd wondered about their mysterious guardian angel. Soon, he'd finally have answers. "Sir," he said, "when do we meet her?" Morrison smiled for the first time since the briefing began. "Tomorrow evening, 1900 hours. And gentlemen, bring your families if you want to. Ms. Chun saved more than just your lives that day. She saved everyone who depends on you." As they prepared to leave, Jackson turned back to Morrison. "Sir, one more thing. What happens if the official investigation doesn't go her way? What happens if the system decides to prosecute her instead of recognizing what she did?" Morrison's expression grew serious again. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, petty officer. But I can tell you this. If Sarah Chun gets hung out to dry for saving the lives of American servicemen, it'll be over my dead body." Rodriguez felt a surge of respect for the commander. It took courage to stand up for what was right when the system preferred what was convenient. As they walked out of the building, Thompson voiced what they were all thinking. "You know, guys, tomorrow we're going to meet the person who gave us the chance to come home. Whatever else happens, whatever legal mess this turns into, we owe her more than we can ever repay." Rodriguez nodded, thinking about his wife and daughter waiting for him at home. Tomorrow, he'd finally get the chance to say thank you to the woman who'd made it possible for him to see them again. The evening air was crisp as they separated to head home to their families. Each of them carried the weight of anticipation for the meeting that would finally put a face to their guardian angel. For Rodriguez, it felt like a circle was finally going to be completed. A debt of honor that had been hanging over him for 3 years was about to be acknowledged. As he drove home, Rodriguez found himself thinking about courage and sacrifice in ways he hadn't considered before. Sarah Chun had given up everything, her career, her legal status, her future, to do what she thought was right. Tomorrow, he'd get to tell her that her sacrifice had mattered more than she could possibly know. Sarah Chun sat in her modest hotel room, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. 24 hours from now, she would face the men whose lives she had saved 3 years ago. The thought filled her with a mixture of anticipation and terror that she hadn't felt since her first combat deployment. She had spent the morning walking around the base perimeter, observing the daily routines of military life she had once known so well. The sight of young Marines conducting drill exercises brought back memories of her own early days in the Corps, when everything seemed clear and the future stretched ahead like an open highway. Those days felt like they belonged to someone else now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Morrison. "Meeting confirmed for 1900 tomorrow. Building 247, Conference Room B. Are you ready for this?" Sarah typed back, "As ready as I'll ever be." But the truth was more complicated. For 3 years, she had lived with the knowledge that she had saved those men. It had been one of the few things that gave her comfort during the darkest periods of her exile. But she had always imagined them as abstract figures, symbols of the good she had managed to accomplish despite the chaos of her situation. Tomorrow, they would become real people with names, faces, families, and stories. The weight of that reality was more intimidating than facing enemy fire had ever been. Sarah's reflection showed a woman who bore little resemblance to the confident Marine who had graduated from Scout Sniper School 6 years earlier. Her hair was longer now, streaked with premature gray from stress and hard living. Lines around her eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much time spent watching her back. But her hands were steady, and her eyes still held the focus that had made her one of the best snipers in her class. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Commander Morrison the day before. He had been direct with her about the potential consequences of coming forward. Court-martial was a real possibility. Prison time was not out of the question. Her military record would be permanently stained, and any hope of a normal civilian career would be severely complicated. But he had also been honest about something else. The men she had saved wanted to meet her. That knowledge had stirred something in her that she hadn't felt in years, the sense that her actions had mattered to real people in a real way. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing an email she had been composing in her head for weeks. It was addressed to her former platoon sergeant, Master Sergeant Williams, who had been like a father to her during her time in the Corps. "Sergeant Williams," she wrote, "I know this email will come as a shock. You probably thought I was dead or disappeared forever after my discharge. The truth is more complicated than that, and I'm finally in a position to explain what really happened. 3 years ago, I made choices that I'm not proud of. I let my anger and hurt cloud my judgment, and I ended up living in the shadows instead of fighting through proper channels to resolve my situation. But during that time, I also did something that I believe honored the training and values you instilled in me. I saved the lives of 6 Navy SEALs who were ambushed in Afghanistan. I'm coming forward now to tell that story, knowing that it will likely end any chance I have of returning to normal life. But I think you taught me that doing the right thing isn't about calculating personal costs. Tomorrow I meet those SEALs for the first time. I am scared, Sergeant, not of the legal consequences, but of disappointing people who see me as some kind of hero when I know I'm really just someone who made a lot of mistakes and got lucky enough to do one thing right. I wanted you to know what happened before it becomes official. Whatever comes next, I want you to know that the Marine you trained is still in here somewhere, trying to find her way home." Sarah stared at the draft for several minutes, then deleted it without sending. Some conversations needed to happen face to face. The next evening arrived faster than Sarah had expected. She dressed carefully in clean civilian clothes that were nevertheless military in their precision. Pressed slacks, polished shoes, a simple blouse that wouldn't restrict her movement. Old habits died hard. Building 247 turned out to be a modern conference facility used for briefings and training sessions. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early and found Commander Morrison waiting for her in the parking lot. "How are you feeling?" he asked as they walked toward the entrance. "Like I'm about to jump out of an airplane without checking my parachute," Sarah replied. Morrison chuckled. "That's probably appropriate. Sarah, I want you to know that these men have spent the last day talking to their families about tonight. They're not coming here out of curiosity. They're coming here to say thank you." They reached conference room B, and Morrison paused with his hand on the door handle. "Before we go in, I need to tell you something." Chief Rodriguez asked if he could bring his daughter. She's 8 years old, and she wanted to meet the person who helped her daddy come home. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Sir, I don't think I'm ready for that." "Sarah, you saved that man's life. His daughter exists in a world where her father comes home every night because of choices you made. She has a right to thank you for that." Morrison opened the door before Sarah could respond. Inside, she saw 3 men in dress uniforms standing at attention beside a conference table. They were older than she had expected, with the bearing of experienced soldiers who had seen combat and survived. Behind them stood women and children, wives she assumed, and the daughter Morrison had mentioned. Chief Rodriguez stepped forward first. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that suggested natural leadership. "Ms. Chun, I'm Chief Petty Officer Danny Rodriguez. On behalf of my team, I want to thank you for what you did in the Karangal Valley." Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the formality of the moment. These men had dressed in their finest uniforms to meet her, had brought their families to witness this encounter. The weight of their respect was almost unbearable. "Chief Rodriguez," she managed, "I'm honored to meet you. All of you." Petty Officer Thompson stepped forward next. He was tall and lean, with sandy hair and a crooked smile that probably charmed everyone he met. "Ms. Chun, this is my wife Maria and my sons David and Michael. Boys, this is the lady we told you about." The older boy, who couldn't have been more than 10, stepped forward with the serious expression of a child who had been coached about the importance of the moment. "Thank you for saving my dad," he said simply. Sarah knelt down to meet the boy at eye level. "David, Your father is a very brave man. It was my honor to help him." The third SEAL, Petty Officer Jackson, was quieter than the others. When he introduced his wife and teenage daughter, Sarah could see emotion he was struggling to control. "Ms. Chun," he said, "my daughter is applying to the Naval Academy next year. She says she wants to be like you." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. The idea that someone would want to be like her, given the mistakes she had made and the years she had spent in exile, was almost incomprehensible. "Jackson," she said, "your daughter should want to be better than me. She should want to serve with honor from beginning to end, not make the kind of mistakes that I made." The teenager, who had her father's serious demeanor and her mother's gentle eyes, spoke up. "Miss Chun, my dad told me what you did. He said you risked everything to save people you didn't even know. That's the kind of person I want to be." Morrison had arranged chairs in a circle, and gradually everyone sat down. Sarah found herself facing the three SEALs while their families formed a supportive presence around the edges of the conversation. Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair. "Ms. Chun, we've read the reports about what happened that day, but we've never heard the story from your perspective. Would you mind telling us how it looked from the ridge?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the events of that day. She described watching their insertion, observing the insurgent positions, realizing that they were walking into an ambush. She explained her decision to abandon her observation post and move to the ridge with her rifle. "I knew I was breaking orders," she said. "My team leader had explicitly told us that we were not to engage unless directly threatened. But I watched you take casualties in the opening seconds of the ambush, and I couldn't just sit there." Thompson interrupted. "What kind of range were you dealing with?" Sarah smiled grimly. "The machine gun positions were between 600 and 800 meters. The RPG teams were closer, maybe 500 to 600. But there was a spotter calling in mortar fire from about 1,200 meters out. That was the longest shot." Jackson whistled softly. "Jesus, in combat conditions, with wind at those ranges, how many shots did you take total?" 31 rounds, Sarah replied without hesitation. 18 hits, 13 misses. Not my best day, but adequate under the circumstances." Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. "Miss Chun, I need you to understand something. What you call adequate saved our lives. Without your intervention, none of us would have made it to the extraction point." The conversation continued for over an hour. Sarah answered their questions about the tactical situation, the insurgent positions, the equipment she had been using. But gradually, the discussion shifted to more personal territory. Rodriguez's 8-year-old daughter had been sitting quietly beside her mother. But finally, she climbed down from her chair and approached Sarah. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded. "Were you scared when you were helping my daddy?" The question was so direct and innocent that Sarah found herself answering with complete honesty. "Yes, sweetie, I was very scared. But sometimes being scared doesn't matter as much as doing what's right." The little girl considered this seriously. "My daddy says that courage means doing your job, even when you're scared." Sarah looked at Rodriguez, who was watching the exchange with obvious pride in his daughter. "Your daddy is absolutely right." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in years. These men and their families weren't treating her like a criminal or a ghost from a classified operation. They were treating her like someone who had made a difference in their lives. Thompson's wife, Maria, had been quiet for most of the conversation, but finally, she spoke up. "Ms. Chun, I want you to know that Tommy talks about that day sometimes. Not often, because it's hard for him. But he's told me that he thinks about the person who saved them, wondering who they were and whether they made it home safely." Thompson nodded. "For 3 years, I've carried around this debt that I couldn't repay. I knew someone had risked their life for us, but I didn't know who or how to thank them." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "You don't owe me anything. What I did was just basic human decency." Rodriguez stood up and walked to where Sarah was sitting. "Ms. Chun, with your permission, I'd like to do something." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Rodriguez came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute. "On behalf of the men you saved and the families you protected, Thank you for your service and your sacrifice." One by one, Thompson and Jackson stood and joined the salute. Then, Thompson's sons, following their father's example, stood at their own version of attention. Jackson's daughter rose from her chair with the precision of someone who had grown up around military traditions. Finally, Rodriguez's 8-year-old daughter slipped away from her mother and stood beside the SEALs, her small hand raised in an approximation of a salute that broke Sarah's heart with its sincerity. Sarah rose to return the salute, and, for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was truly coming home. These people weren't judging her for the mistakes she had made or the years she had spent in exile. They were honoring her for the moment when she had chosen to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. As the families prepared to leave, Rodriguez approached Sarah one more time. "Ms. Chun, I know you're facing legal challenges because of your situation. I want you to know that my teammates and I will do whatever we can to help. You saved our lives. The least we can do is stand up for you when the system tries to tear you down." Sarah shook hands with each of the SEALs and their family members. As they filed out of the conference room, she found herself alone with Commander Morrison. "How do you feel?" he asked. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes and smiled. Like maybe coming forward was the right choice after all. Morrison nodded. "Sarah, tomorrow we start the official process. There will be interviews, investigations, probably a court-martial. It's going to be difficult." Sarah straightened her shoulders with the bearing of the Marine she had always been. "Sir, for the first time in 3 years, I know who I'm fighting for. That makes everything else manageable." As they walked out of the building together, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before that IED explosion had changed her life forever. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone 3 weeks after the meeting with the SEAL team. Sarah Chun found herself sitting in a military courtroom facing a panel of officers who would determine her fate. The formal investigation had moved quickly once Commander Morrison submitted his initial report, and the military justice system had decided that her case required immediate attention. The charges against her were serious: unauthorized absence, desertion, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and violation of her oath of enlistment. If convicted on all counts, she could face up to 10 years in military prison and a dishonorable discharge that would follow her for the rest of her civilian life. But as Sarah sat at the defendant's table beside her military-appointed attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes, she felt calmer than she had expected. The courtroom was packed with people who had come to support her, including the 3 SEALs and their families, Commander Morrison, and several Marines from her former unit who had traveled across the country to attend the proceedings. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. Major Patricia Donovan, the prosecuting attorney, laid out a timeline of Sarah's actions following her supposed discharge. She presented evidence that Sarah had failed to report to proper authorities when her paperwork was lost, had chosen to remain in Afghanistan without authorization, and had worked for private military contractors while technically still bound by her military oath. Members of the panel, Major Donovan said during her opening statement, "The defendant's actions, however well-intentioned, constitute a clear violation of military law and good order. The military depends on discipline and following proper channels. When individuals take matters into their own hands, regardless of the circumstances, it undermines the entire system of military justice." The prosecution called several witnesses to establish the timeline of events and the legal framework surrounding Sarah's case. A personnel specialist testified about the proper procedures for handling discharge paperwork. A military lawyer explained the legal obligations that continued to bind Sarah even after her supposed discharge. An intelligence officer discussed the security implications of having an unaccounted-for Marine operating in a combat zone. Throughout the prosecution's case, Sarah maintained her composure. She had known these charges were coming, and she had already decided that accepting responsibility for her actions was more important than fighting the legal technicalities that might get her off on procedural grounds. The turning point came when Lieutenant Colonel Hayes began the defense case. Instead of challenging the facts of what Sarah had done, She focused on the context that had led to those actions and the results they had achieved. The first defense witness was Master Sergeant Williams, Sarah's former platoon sergeant. He was a weathered man in his late 40s who commanded respect simply by walking into the room. Williams testified about Sarah's character during her active duty service. "Sir," he told the panel, "in 26 years of Marine Corps service, I've trained hundreds of Marines. Sarah Chun was among the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to work with. She was technically proficient, morally sound, and completely dedicated to the welfare of her fellow Marines." Williams went on to describe the impact of the IED explosion that had killed 3 of Sarah's teammates and set in motion the chain of events that led to her current situation. The explosion didn't just cause physical injuries, he explained. It destroyed the tight-knit team that had become her military family. When the bureaucratic system failed her after that trauma, she was dealing with grief, survivor's guilt, and untreated PTSD. The prosecution objected several times during Williams' testimony, arguing that Sarah's psychological state didn't excuse her violations of military law. But the panel members, several of whom were combat veterans themselves, clearly understood the human dimension of what had happened. Next, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called Commander Morrison to testify. Morrison described the investigation that had led to Sarah's identification as the mysterious sniper from Operation Desert Falcon. He explained how her tactical knowledge and precise recollection of details had convinced him that she was telling the truth about her involvement. "The evidence is overwhelming that Ms. Chun saved the lives of 6 Navy SEALs during a classified operation," Morrison testified. "Her actions were tactically sound, professionally executed, and morally courageous. She risked her own safety to protect American service members who were in mortal danger." Morrison's testimony was followed by the 3 SEALs whose lives Sarah had saved. Chief Rodriguez took the stand first, his dress uniform decorated with ribbons that testified to his own distinguished service. "Sir," Rodriguez told the panel, "I've been in combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. MS. Chun made one of those decisions, and she made it perfectly. Her intervention was the only reason my team survived that engagement." Rodriguez described the tactical situation in detail, explaining how Sarah's precise shooting had systematically dismantled the insurgent attack. He emphasized that her target selection demonstrated professional military training and deep understanding of small unit tactics. "This wasn't random shooting," Rodriguez emphasized. "This was a trained professional using her skills to save American lives. If that's not worthy of recognition rather than punishment, then I don't understand what our military values are supposed to mean." Petty Officer Thompson's testimony was more personal. He spoke about his wife and children, about the life he had been able to live because Sarah had chosen to break her orders and help his team. "My son David is 10 years old now," Thompson said, his voice steady but emotional. "He's learned to play baseball, he's doing well in school, and he has a father who comes home every night. That's possible because MS." Chun decided that saving American lives was more important than following orders that would have resulted in our deaths. Thompson paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Sir, I've thought about that day every single day for 3 years. I wondered who saved us and why. Now I know it was a Marine who had been abandoned by the system, but who still upheld the highest traditions of military service when it mattered most." Petty Officer Jackson's testimony focused on the technical aspects of what Sarah had accomplished. As a former military marksman himself, he was qualified to speak about the difficulty of the shot she had made. "Sir, the shooting that Ms. Chun accomplished that day was extraordinary by any standard. We're talking about precision rifle work at extreme range, under combat conditions, with lives hanging in the balance. The level of skill and composure required to execute those shots is something that very few people in the world possess." Jackson explained that each of Sarah's 18 confirmed kills have been achieved with single shots at distances ranging from 600 to 1,200 meters. "Sir, that's not luck. That's not accidental. That's world-class marksmanship employed in defense of American service members. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Rodriguez's 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had asked her father if she could speak to the court. After much deliberation, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had decided to call her as a witness. Emma took the stand wearing her best dress, her small hands folded carefully in her lap. When asked about her relationship to the case, she answered in a clear, serious voice that echoed through the silent courtroom. "The lady helped my daddy come home," Emma said simply. "Daddy told me that bad people tried to hurt him and his friends, but the lady stopped them. She made sure my daddy could come home to me and Mommy." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes asked Emma if she understood why the court was trying to decide whether Sarah had done something wrong. Emma considered the question with the gravity that children bring to important matters. "I know some people think she broke rules, but Daddy says that sometimes you have to choose between rules and doing what's right. The lady chose to save my daddy. I think that was the right thing to do." The prosecution's cross-examination of Emma was brief and gentle, but the child's testimony had already made its impact. Several panel members were visibly moved by her simple, direct statement about the human consequences of Sarah's actions. The final defense witness was Sarah herself. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had debated whether to put her on the stand, knowing that it would expose her to aggressive cross-examination. But Sarah had insisted that she wanted the panel to hear directly from her about why she had made the choices she did. Sarah took the oath with the bearing of a professional soldier, her voice clear and unwavering. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes led her through her military background, her training as a scout sniper, and the events leading up to her deployment to Afghanistan. Sarah's testimony about the IED explosion and its aftermath was devastating. She described watching her teammates die, dealing with her own injuries, and struggling with the bureaucratic maze that had left her in legal limbo. "Sir," she told the panel, "I know that my decision to stay in Afghanistan rather than return to the United States was wrong. I was angry, hurt, and not thinking clearly. I felt like the Marine Corps had abandoned me. So I abandoned my obligations to the Marine Corps." Sarah went on to describe her work with private military contractors and the events that led to her being in the Korangal Valley during Operation Desert Falcon. She explained her decision to break orders and provide overwatch protection for the SEAL team. "Sir, I knew that engaging the insurgents would violate my orders and potentially expose my team's position. But I also knew that 6 American servicemen were about to die if someone didn't act. For me, that wasn't really a choice at all." Sarah's voice remained steady as she described the 18 shots that had saved the SEAL team. She provided tactical details with professional precision, but she also conveyed the emotional weight of the decision she had made. "I've had 3 years to think about the choices I made," Sarah concluded. "I regret the anger and hurt that led me to abandon my duties to the Marine Corps. I regret the years I spent operating outside the law. But I don't regret saving those men's lives. I would make that same choice again without hesitation." The prosecution's cross-examination was aggressive but respectful. Major Donovan challenged Sarah about her decision to work for private contractors, her failure to seek proper assistance for her legal problems, and her violation of direct orders during the engagement with insurgents. Sarah answered each question directly and honestly. She acknowledged her mistakes without making excuses, but she also stood firm in her conviction that saving American lives had been the right thing to do. "Major," Sarah said during one particularly heated exchange, "you're correct that I violated military law. You're correct that I failed to follow proper procedures. But I want to be absolutely clear about one thing. If I had followed orders that day, 6 Navy SEALs would be dead. I'll accept whatever punishment this court decides is appropriate, but I won't apologize for keeping those men alive." After closing arguments from both sides, the panel deliberated for 6 hours. During that time, Sarah sat with her attorney in the conference room that had been designated for the defense team. The SEALs and their families waited in the hallway, along with Marines from Sarah's former unit who had come to show their support. When the panel returned to announce their verdict, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Sarah stood at attention as the panel president, Colonel James Mitchell, prepared to read the findings. On the charge of unauthorized absence, Colonel Mitchell announced, "We find the defendant guilty." Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she maintained her military bearing. On the charge of desertion, "We find the defendant not guilty." Sarah blinked in surprise. The desertion charge had been the most serious, carrying the longest potential prison sentence. On the charge of conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, "We find the defendant guilty." Sarah nodded, having expected this verdict. On the charge of violation of oath of enlistment, "We find the defendant not guilty." The mixed verdicts reflected the panel's struggle to balance Sarah's legal violations against the extraordinary circumstances that had led to them. Colonel Mitchell then announced the sentence: reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of 6 months' pay, and a reprimand to be filed in her permanent record. No prison time. No dishonorable discharge. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't finished. The panel also wishes to make a recommendation to the appropriate authorities that Private Chin's actions in saving the lives of American service members be recognized through appropriate military honors. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She had been prepared for the worst, but the panel had clearly recognized the complexity of her situation and the valor she had shown when it mattered most. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Chief Rodriguez approached Sarah with his daughter Emma. The little girl looked up at Sarah with serious eyes. "Are you going to be okay now?" Emma asked. Sarah knelt down to meet the child at eye level. "Yes, sweetie. I think I'm going to be just fine." Emma smiled and threw her arms around Sarah's neck. "I'm glad you helped my daddy come home." As Sarah hugged the little girl whose father she had saved, she realized that the long journey back from the shadows was finally complete. She was no longer a ghost, no longer unregistered and unknown. She was a Marine who had made mistakes and paid for them, but who had also upheld the highest traditions of military service when it mattered most. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in years, Sarah Chin knew exactly who she was and where she belonged 2 years after her court-martial. Sarah Chin stood in the same conference room where she had first met the SEALs whose lives she had saved. But this time, the circumstances were entirely different. She was wearing a crisp Marine Corps dress blue uniform, complete with ribbons that told the story of her military service, including a Navy Cross that had been awarded 6 months earlier in a private Pentagon ceremony. The room was packed with people who had become important parts of her life during her journey back from the shadows. Commander Morrison, now promoted to captain, sat at the head of the table. The 3 SEALs were present with their families, including Rodriguez's daughter Emma, now 10 years old and still as serious and thoughtful as ever. But the most significant presence in the room was Master Sergeant Williams, her former platoon sergeant, who had been instrumental in helping her rebuild her life after the court-martial. Williams had taken early retirement from the Marine Corps specifically to help Sarah establish a nonprofit organization that would provide support for military personnel who fell through bureaucratic cracks. Sarah looked around the room at the faces that had become family to her. 2 years earlier, she had been a ghost with no legal identity and no hope for the future. Today, she was the director of a thriving organization that had already helped dozens of service members navigate the complex challenges of military bureaucracy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Morrison began, "we're here today to celebrate the 2nd anniversary of the Warrior Advocate Foundation and to announce some significant developments in our mission." The Warrior Advocate Foundation had been Sarah's idea, born from her own experience of being lost in the system. With support from the SEALs, Commander Morrison, and a growing network of military and civilian allies, the organization provided legal assistance, advocacy, and support services for service members who found themselves in administrative limbo. The foundation had handled cases ranging from simple paperwork errors to complex situations involving service members who had been declared dead while still alive or who had been discharged due to bureaucratic mistakes. Sarah's own experience gave her unique credibility with both the service members who needed help and the military officials who had the power to resolve their problems. Chief Rodriguez, now promoted to senior chief, stood up to address the group. "Sarah, When we first met 2 years ago, I told you that we owed you a debt we could never repay. What you've accomplished with the Warrior Advocate Foundation proves that we were wrong about that." Rodriguez smiled as he continued. "You've taken the worst experience of your life and turned it into a way to help other people avoid the same fate. That's not just paying it forward. That's transforming suffering into service in the highest tradition of the military." The Foundation's success had been remarkable. In 2 years, they had resolved over 300 cases of service members who had been caught in bureaucratic nightmares. They had successfully lobbied for changes to military regulations that would prevent situations like Sarah's from occurring in the future. And they had established partnerships with veterans organizations across the country to ensure that no service member would ever again fall through the cracks the way Sarah had. Petty Officer Thompson, now a chief himself, stood up to share a story. Last month, the Foundation helped a Navy corpsman whose medical discharge paperwork had been lost in the system. He'd been trying to get his benefits restored for 18 months, sleeping in his car and working minimum wage jobs because he couldn't prove his military service. Thompson paused, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah got his case resolved in 6 weeks. He's now getting the medical care he needs and the benefits he earned. His kids don't have to worry about whether Daddy has a place to sleep. That's the kind of difference this organization makes every single day. Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. After her court-martial, she had spent several months working with military counselors to address the PTSD and survivor's guilt that had contributed to her original problems. The process had been difficult, but it had helped her understand that her anger at the system had been justified, even if her response to it had been wrong. The turning point had come during one of her counseling sessions when she realized that she had a choice. She could spend the rest of her life bitter about what the system had done to her, or she could use her experience to help fix the system for other people. The choice had been easier than she expected. Emma Rodriguez raised her hand from her seat next to her father. "Can I say something?" Sarah smiled and nodded. Emma had become something of a mascot for the Foundation, often attending events with her parents and charming donors with her straightforward observations about military life. Emma stood up with the serious demeanor that had characterized her even as a small child. "I want to thank Miss Sarah for saving my daddy, but I also want to thank her for something else." The room fell quiet as Emma continued. "Last year, Miss Sarah helped my friend Katie's dad get his benefits back when the Army said he wasn't really hurt in Afghanistan. Katie was really scared that her family would lose their house. Miss Sarah made sure that didn't happen." Emma looked directly at Sarah. "Miss Sarah teaches us that heroes aren't just people who do brave things once. Heroes are people who keep doing brave things, even when nobody is watching." The simple profundity of the child's observation brought tears to several eyes in the room. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she realized that this little girl understood something that many adults missed, that true heroism was about consistency of character rather than moments of dramatic action. Captain Morrison stood up and walked to a presentation easel that had been covered with a sheet. "Sarah, the Foundation has achieved something that very few nonprofit organizations accomplish in their first 2 years. You've not only established a sustainable operation, but you've also begun to change the culture within military bureaucracy." He pulled away the sheet to reveal a chart showing the Foundation's impact statistics. 312 cases resolved, 14 regulatory changes implemented, 22 partnerships established with other veterans organizations, and, perhaps most importantly, 0 service members who have approached the Foundation for help have been turned away. The numbers were impressive, but Sarah knew that behind each statistic was a human story. There was the Army sergeant whose medical records had been lost, leaving him unable to get treatment for combat injuries. There was the Air Force technical sergeant whose discharge had been processed incorrectly, making him ineligible for veterans' benefits despite 12 years of distinguished service. There was the Navy petty officer whose security clearance had been revoked due to a clerical error, ending his career in military intelligence. Each case had been different, but they all shared common elements. Service members who had been failed by bureaucratic systems, who had been told their problems weren't anyone's responsibility, who had been left to navigate complex military regulations without help or guidance. The Foundation had become their advocate, their voice within a system that was often too large and impersonal to hear individual cries for help. Master Sergeant Williams stood up to address the group. "Sarah, I want to tell you something that I should have said 2 years ago. When you first came back and told me about everything that had happened, I was angry. Not at you, but at the system that had failed you so completely." Williams paused, his weathered face showing the emotion he rarely displayed. "I've spent 28 years in the Marine Corps, and I thought I understood how the system worked. Your case taught me that there were gaps in our support structure that I had never imagined. The work you're doing isn't just helping individual service members. It's making the entire military better." Sarah stood up to respond to the group. Looking around the room at the faces of people who had become her chosen family, she felt a peace and purpose that had eluded her for most of her adult life. 2 years ago, I sat in the same room convinced that I was broken beyond repair, Sarah began. I thought that my mistakes had disqualified me from ever serving my country again. What I learned from all of you is that service isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance. Sarah looked at each of the SEALs in turn. "Rodriguez, Thompson, Jackson, you taught me that my actions had consequences beyond what I could see, that the choice I made on a ridge in Afghanistan rippled out to affect families, communities, futures that I couldn't have imagined." She turned to Captain Morrison. "Sir, you taught me that admitting mistakes isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of redemption." Finally, she looked at Master Sergeant Williams. "Sergeant Williams, you taught me that the values we learned in the military don't end when we take off the uniform. They're supposed to guide us for the rest of our lives." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "The Warrior Advocate Foundation exists because we believe that service members deserve better than what I experienced. We believe that bureaucratic failures shouldn't derail lives that have been dedicated to serving our country. And we believe that every service member who raises their hand to defend this nation deserves to have someone raise their hand for them when they need help." She paused and smiled at Emma Rodriguez. "But most importantly, we believe that heroes aren't defined by their worst moments. They're defined by what they do next." Captain Morrison stood up and began a clap. One by one, everyone in the room joined in the applause. But Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about the phone call she had received that morning from a young Army specialist whose medical discharge paperwork had gone missing. He was scared, confused, and didn't know where to turn for help. Tomorrow, Sarah would take his case and add it to the Foundation's active files. She would assign one of their advocates to work with him. She would use the connections she had built over 2 years to navigate the bureaucracy that had once seemed impenetrable. And she would make sure that another service member didn't fall through the cracks the way she had. As the formal meeting concluded and people began to mingle, Rodriguez approached Sarah with his daughter. Emma had grown taller in the past year, but she still had the same serious eyes that had impressed Sarah during their first meeting. "Ms. Sarah," Emma said, "I have a question." Sarah knelt down to meet the girl at eye level, as had become their tradition. "What's your question, Emma? Are you happy now?" The question was so direct and innocent that Sarah found herself considering it carefully before answering. Was she happy? She thought about the 2 years since her court-martial, the work she had been doing, the lives that had been changed by the Foundation's interventions. "Yes, Emma," Sarah said finally. "I think I am happy. Not because everything in my life has been perfect, but because I know that my life has meaning and purpose." Emma nodded seriously. "Daddy says that happiness isn't about getting everything you want. It's about using everything you have to help other people." Sarah hugged the little girl who had become such an important part of her journey back to herself. "Emma, your daddy is a very wise man." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Sarah found herself alone in the conference room where her new life had begun. She thought about the letter she had never sent to Master Sergeant Williams, the one where she had wondered if the Marine he had trained was still somewhere inside her. Now she knew the answer. That Marine had never really gone away. She had just gotten lost for a while in anger, hurt, and bureaucratic confusion. But the values that Williams had instilled in her loyalty, honor, courage, commitment had remained intact beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the base where young Marines were learning the lessons that would guide them through their military careers and beyond. Some of them would face challenges that would test their resolve. Some would make mistakes that would haunt them. Some would find themselves lost in systems too large and complex for individual voices to be heard. But now, at least, they would have the Warrior Advocate Foundation standing ready to help them find their way home. They would have advocates who understood that service members were more than just numbers in a bureaucratic system. They would have someone to remind the military that its greatest strength lay not in its weapons or technology, but in the men and women who chose to serve. Sarah Chun had spent 3 years as a ghost, unregistered and unknown except to the men whose lives she had saved. Now she was visible again, not as the perfect Marine she had once tried to be, but as something perhaps more valuable, a flawed human being who had found a way to transform her worst experiences into service for others. As she walked out of the building and into the evening air, Sarah felt the weight of purpose that had been missing from her life for so many years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new service members who needed help, new battles with bureaucracy that sometimes seemed designed to defeat rather than support the people it was meant to serve. But tonight, Sarah Chun was exactly where she belonged, not hiding in the shadows, but standing in the light as a Marine who had learned that the most important battles are often fought not with weapons, but with persistence, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to leave no one behind.